Hello, everybody. This is Paul Tryanowski, Chief Conservation Officer at SFI, and we are about to get started in the first of what we hope will be a series of webinars regarding conservation impact, the work that's taking place at SFI and with a lot of conservation partners, as you'll hear. I just want to remind people of a couple of things before we get started. The first is that to ask you please to mute your phones. We can hear a lot of noise on the line right now, and it would be helpful to all of us if you could mute your line unless you're specifically coming in to ask a question or from presenting at some point. The other thing we would like to let you know is that this session will be recorded so that you can review it and also pass it along to any other interested parties who may not have been able to join us today. I want to offer my thanks first to Andrew DeVries at SFI and also Rocco Saracena at SFI, who've been a tremendous help in trying to set up this call, and ask you all to please be on the lookout in the future for other webinars that we will conduct in this series as we talk more about our conservation impact work. So we have an hour and a half set up for this discussion. We've asked each of our presenters to limit their remarks to about a half hour. And so after I provide some introductory remarks, we'll turn to our presenters and introduce them properly. And we'll make sure that leaves some time for questions at the end. And so if you do have any questions along the way, you're certainly welcome to type those into the message box on your screen, and we'll be able to refer to those at the appropriate time. But for now, let's go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Paul Tryanowski, as you see on your screen, Chief Conservation Officer at SFI, and we wanted to share a little bit with you about what this conservation impact work is. So beginning a couple of years ago, SFI set out on an effort and a mission, if you will, to try to develop a better understanding of the metrics around conservation outcomes on well-managed lands. So our goal is to seek the development of measurable metrics that are based in good science and research. They need to be repeatable. They need to be translatable, because not everyone who is an audience for this kind of information will be from the science background. And our hope is that this will help us to connect the dots and develop the ability to communicate that value through the supply chain going forward. As we think about the reasons for engaging in this conservation impact work, we believe that brand owners, that is the end consumers of forest products, need to understand the impact of their sourcing from sustainably managed forests. Our own program participants who utilize the SFI program standards need to justify the cost of certification, and external parties, conservation stakeholders, need to better understand the value of forest certification and the value of well-managed forests. And in the long run, our hope is that this improved understanding will facilitate continual improvement in SFI and in sustainable forest management. Just to let you know, the breadth of SFI's work in conservation has been expanding over the last number of years. And so that we believe that this organization plays a critical role at the intersection of sustainable forestry and conservation planning and accomplishment. We've done a number of things related to this work, which I won't talk about at great length now, but I would invite you to send me questions if you do have any. We've engaged in workshops for large landowners and to try to find ways to better engage those large landowners in conservation-related outcomes in important landscapes. We have, of course, our Conservation Impact Sounding Board, which is an opportunity that anyone who is on the phone, if you wish to become involved and have not yet, you're welcome to do so. This is a body that gets together once or twice a year to review our conservation impact projects and to provide input into the direction of these programs and help us fill in gaps. We found this to be a very, very important effort and one that's really been valuable to us as we shape this conservation impact work. SFI also provides some leadership in the green marketplace. Now that SFI is recognized, or SFI products, that is, are recognized as being eligible for certification under the LEED program for green building, for example. And we engage in a lot of different conservation initiatives that involve the role of working forests and well-managed forests and conservation outcomes at scale. Those are just a handful of the things that SFI has been doing. I do want to point out that SFI is distinct from other forest certifications in that we have a research requirement in our standard, and that's unique amongst forest certification standards. This requirement has resulted in about $1.6 billion of research investment that we've tracked since 1995. And just as an example, in 2016, or 2017, these numbers are, there was about 70% of this research was linked to conservation-related objectives, as you can see over to the left side of the screen. We believe this commitment to research is a really fundamental aspect of SFI's work and relates very much to what we're talking about today.
I'm on mute.
We have been working through the SFI Conservation and Community Partnerships Grants Program to expand our ability to understand the contributions of these well-managed forests to conservation outcomes. So for the last couple of years, the grants program, at least the conservation elements of the grants program, have been focused very much on generating understanding of conservation outcomes. By the way, I would ask once again, if you're not presenting at this moment, please go on mute so that we don't hear any noise in the background. Thank you. So I just want to remind you once again, the programs that we're talking about today, the conservation research work today, is actually related to our conservation grants program. We're very grateful for that brand of commitment and involvement from both our program participants and our conservation partners. And if you look back over the last 7 years or so that program has been in place, you'll see that our grant program has been quite expansive in terms of the involvement of different kinds of nonprofit and research and academic and indigenous entities. So we're very proud of that. Lastly, I'll just say we're ready to move on to the presentation portion of this program. Once again, I invite you, if you would like to ask some questions, you're welcome to make note of that in the participant feedback section or to raise your hand in the appropriate way, and we'll try to make sure that we return to you. But we do want to point out this morning we're very pleased to be joined by Dr. Shay Elkins of the University of Northern British Columbia, who will talk to us about the remote sensing LiDAR work to measure biodiversity. We're very excited about that, as well as our partnership with Nature Conservancy Canada, that presentation being offered up by Marie-Andrée Touga-Tellier, who is going to be telling us about their work on the Canuck Preserve relative to vernal pools and other important work taking place there. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Shay. And thank you, Shay, for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. That was a very nice introduction. This is Shay Elton here from UNBC. I'm actually going to be sharing this presentation with Colin Chisholm, the Assistant Manager of the Elise Lake Research Forest and the other key researcher on this project. Now, as Paul did a very nice intro there, the overall focus of our work really is aimed at trying to develop better tools for sustainably managing our forests, and particularly trying to develop tools that will allow us to identify areas within our forested landscape where there are conservation values or conservation hotspots that we may want to target. Secondly, we also want to try to develop quantitative measures that actually allow us to say, this area of forest may be slightly more valuable from a biodiversity point of view. Let's manage it to maintain those values. And finally, as Paul mentioned, a key thing that's underlying this is also providing tools that will allow SFI to monitor and evaluate their certified areas to maintain that they actually are meeting the biodiversity and conservation goals. Now, the way that we're approaching this is looking at using some of the new emergent technologies in order to give us a better understanding of where biodiversity hotspots are on our landscapes and how we can actually quantify them. And the main technology that we have been working with is aerial laser scanning, or LiDAR. And although LiDAR is something that I think both of us in the forest are quite familiar with right now, just a quick overview, at a very basic level, use this technology. What you're basically doing is mounting a laser on a airplane, flying over your land base, shooting down towards the land, and then when the laser hits any type of structure, be it a branch or a leaf, a building or the ground, that's reflected back up to the plane where it records the height of that interception. So basically producing a three-dimensional point cloud that gives you a three-dimensional picture of whatever landscape you're flying over. Now, this can be very valuable for getting high-resolution DEMs or getting images of buildings and whatnot. But in the forestry context, it can also be extremely valuable in that we're getting a three-dimensional picture of what our forest landscape looks like. So in this slide that we're looking at here, we're actually looking from the airplane's point of view down into the canopy of a part of our forest on our research site. And what we're looking at for the top of the trees, they're coming up in the dark red color. And as you go down through the canopy, you're getting into the cooler colors, the darker colors. So there's a couple of things that should really jump out at you when you're looking at this type of data product from ALS. The first is that it gives you a very good indication of what the actual three-dimensional structure of the forest is. Pick out patches where there's smaller trees, patches where there's a combination of big and smaller trees, as well as giving us an idea about what the horizontal distribution of the trees are on the landscape. It's really important for quantifying gap structure and the actual horizontal distribution of the trees. Now, one thing I just want to clarify before going forward, that people who have worked with ALS or LiDAR in the past, they primarily know it in terms of some of the products that are produced from it. On the left-hand side here, we're looking at a high-resolution DEM that's derived from the LiDAR. That's great and provides some really good information for forest management and for planning, but it's just one of the products. Similarly, on the right-hand side, we're looking at a canopy height model for the Eliza Lake Research Forest. Again, extremely valuable information in terms of forest management, but again, just one of the products that can be used. What I want to emphasize here is that for the analysis that we're looking at for biodiversity, what we're really trying to do is use that actual three-dimensional point cloud and figure out ways in which we can extract information about the biodiversity from that point cloud. Now, as I mentioned, at this stage, LiDAR has really exploded over the past 5-10 years, and it's becoming a really fundamental way that we do forestry and that we get information about our forests. One of the biggest advances that this type of technology has allowed is to get a much better idea about what our actual inventory is on our land base. So to do this, we basically fly the LiDAR, get the point cloud that you see in the bottom left-hand corner of this figure here, and then develop models and algorithms that allow us to actually estimate what the height of the individual trees are, what the volume of those trees are, and ideally what the species are. This is all the very important information that will give us a much better idea about what our inventory is and how we can best manage that inventory. Now, at the end of the day, these type of models or these type of algorithms are really taking advantage of some of the tools that we've developed in forestry over the past 200, 300 years. Elementary relationships between tree height, canopy structure, and canopy size that allow us to get fairly good estimates of basal area and volume. Now that's really good, and this is where there's already been considerable work done using LiDAR. What we're proposing is that what we now need to do is develop the same type of algorithms or the same type of frameworks that are moving from that three-dimensional point cloud in order to allow us to get estimates of the biodiversity that we've done. Now, in some ways, this is a little bit more complex because we don't have a readily set of good algorithms that we can just pull from that allow us to say, if I have this point cloud structure, this point cloud density, I know what the estimated biodiversity is going to be. That's really the focus of our project, trying to figure out what those connections are, trying to develop those algorithms for our use. Now, there's a couple of types of information that we're actually going to focus on or that we have been focusing on that readily get ALS data. The first is really where or what your canopy structure looks like and your forest structure looks like. So if you focus on the left-hand side of the graph here, you see a tree that has the laser coming down, it's hitting some of the branches. It's telling us a little bit about the point density, the density mass, X different types of ground, giving us some information about what the canopy structure is, also giving us some information about what the understory structure is, when the laser sometimes passes through the canopy. So really good information about what the vertical structure of the forest is. Similarly, if we look onto the right-hand side, we have the horizontal distribution, and as I mentioned before, from that we can start to calculate metrics that tell us about gap distribution, gap size, gap location. Now what we are aiming to do is to build this information together into algorithms that allow us to then, let's say, what the relative biodiversity value are for different forest types. Now, this connection, this link that we're trying to make is frankly something that people have thought about in forestry for a long time. It's the connection between the structure that we see within the forest and the presumed biodiversity. So if we think about how forestry has changed over the past 30, 40 years, moving more and more towards talking about natural disturbance-based forestry or ecology-based forestry, a lot of those ideas are premised on the assumption that if we can replicate the type of structure in our forest on a landscape scale, that we'll hopefully be able to build in some of the resilience that is naturally part of these systems. Now that's kind of thinking about structure on a horizontal landscape perspective. We can also think about structure and its relationship to biodiversity by thinking about vertical structure. And again, this is something that we're not developing these ideas by ourselves, but we're really relying on some of the longer-term theory that's been developed about why we may actually see positive correlations between biodiversity and the degree of vertical horizontal structure, the degree of heterogeneity that we have within our forest. Now, the framework that we're using also has been applied previous to our work here as well. For example, this is some really nice work that was done by Gao and Nicholas at the University of British Columbia, where they used LiDAR or ALS to capture forest metrics in the middle figure there with the colors, where we're looking at a two-dimensional plot where we can plot various different forest attributes, such as total canopy cover, total canopy height density. And within those point clouds, we can separate out where different forest stand types are. So the bottom left figure, it illustrates how you can use this type of data to differentiate between all forests that have very sparse understory, the intermediate forests that have a very contiguous type of understory structure, the smaller forests where you don't have many big trees, but you've got a very dense canopy cover that flow down. Now, using this framework, what this group was able to do was accurately characterize forest types across a very large land base. So if we look onto the right-hand side of this figure here, they were doing this work across all of the province of Alberta in Western Canada. They were able to accurately capture differences in fairly broad forest types. Now, in our work, what we're doing is using the same type of framework, but really scaling it down to the stand or the block level, where we think that a lot of the management decisions or a lot of the information about biodiversity will be a little bit more useful. Now, to approach this, we're actually looking at a range of different questions. So one of the main questions that we're looking at is what structural attributes actually define areas of high diversity or high biodiversity. Secondly, we're asking the question, what structures and attributes really characterize old forests? And we'll talk about in a second what we mean by old forests, because we recognize that is something that is context dependent. But if we say that there's old forests on their landscape, the question that we address is there a way that we can accurately distinguish between those old forests and forests that have been either previously managed or harvested? The final question or group of questions that our work is looking at is kind of much broader, and it asks the general question, what is the scale at which we really should be evaluating forest biodiversity in order to capture the resolution of the ecological characteristics that define it, while also trying to capture the scale at which the ecological processes that drive biodiversity are actually occurring on. And with that, I'll just pass it over to Colin for a little bit. We will talk about what we actually mean in terms of old forests for our research site. Because as I mentioned, old forest is lots of people in society, they'll have some idea about what they mean by an old forest. Talk to a forester, they may also have a different idea about what an old forest means. But we also have definitions of old forests that built into our regulatory and our certification framework. So with that, I'll pass on to Colin.
Thanks, Jay. Colin Chisholm here from the Eliza Lake Research Forest. And here I wanted to move into the British Columbia understanding of what old forests are. And these are actually defined forests through regulatory mechanisms. And essentially an old forest is anything that's 140 years old or older. And depending on the management area that you're in, you'll have a certain percent area target. A certain percentage of the area needs to be maintained in or state, a state of 140 years or older. But how do we take inventory of these old forests? The image on the slide here, we've got an aerial photo cover with polygons drawn on it. This is taken from the provincial inventory data that we have. These polygons were part of a major photo interpretation project where photo interpreters drew polygons around stands that they defined through their work. And when they were doing that, they assigned as best they could an age class to each of those stands. So lots of these stands have an age class of 8, as you can see on the slide. Age class 8 is anything that's 140 years to 250 years old. Unfortunately, it's not a perfect way of doing it. We didn't have boots on the ground for all of these polygons. And really, we don't have any technology to date that can actually tell us the age of a tree. So it was the best guess. But with our work with looking at the LiDAR, the ALS, we really want to ask, can we actually do a better job of characterizing or quantifying some of the old forest attributes? So here at Eliza Lake Research Forest, we have a target of maintaining 30% of our forest as old forest on a 9,000 hectare area-based tenure. We're located in central British Columbia, just 70 kilometers to the east of Prince George, in the central interior plateau. Our forests are dominated by spruce or coniferous, dominated by spruce and subalpine fir, and we've seen some active management over the last 90 years. We've got a really rich and moist ecology here, spruce and balsam, as I mentioned, but also the understory coming up very dense. With this image, we've got the Devil's Club coming up, and it's coming up to 1 meter, sometimes 2 meters in height, depending on each site. A really rich site ecologically, but also a really rich site with its history, with its research going back to the 1920s, as well as active harvest management for the central interior in particular, going all the way back almost a century, which is in our area a long time. As we consider these stands, we want to ask, well, what can the LiDAR tell us? That being on the plateau, it's also really distinct because with these subtle landscapes, a very subtle change in the landform can actually lead to a big change in the forest cover. So in this image, we have a black spruce stand, transitioning to a subalpine fir stand, to a really highly productive, high volume root stand, high volume, high biodiversity stand on the right-hand side. So we get different stand characteristics giving us different attributes that would influence the biodiversity in those sites. And really the only difference between all these sites is 1.2 meters of soil depth above the water table. So really subtle landscapes, the LiDAR is able to provide us significant information on why that could be. I want to break it down as just how did we set up our project. This is an image of the whole research forest. And first we wanted to break this into different treatments essentially. First, broke it into, it was a harvest history or no harvest history. So HH for harvest history, old growth, no harvest history, OG. And then landform, we actually broke the site into 4 different landscape units. The knolls, which is on the north end, really rolling terrain, average slopes from 5 to 20%. Plateau, which is the bulk of the forest, average slopes of 0 to 5%. Two other units which we haven't looked at to date are the Vernal floodplain on the south, which is red cones, hemlock leaf stand on some talus material. In the site, we broke them into plots. We're going to have plots over a hectare, and each of those plots is 25 meters square. A lot of mixed methods. We're looking at the LiDAR data, a lot of behind the computer terminal work, see what metrics we can pull from that. We don't want to correlate that well with what we can find on the ground. Lots of band-aids out there with staff, biodiversity metrics. This is, again, as Jay mentioned, tied to what happened in literature in the past. A couple of good papers here referenced for you. Our key LiDAR metrics, we're really keying on what was the height of the site, our canopy cover, canopy density, or complexity in the stand. The data for the LiDAR data was acquired in May of 2015. What I should really need to point out with this, after the LiDAR data, after the snow melted, we get quite a bit of snowfall here, but before the leaf broke, before the leaves came out, before that herbaceous vegetation, that deep double club or deep ferns came out of the ground. So we were able to have a very clear view of the forest without herbaceous vegetation covering up some of the aspects of it. We used a regal system. We're targeting 10 points of LiDAR here, with multiple returns, hitting a branch, multiple branches down the ground. We got an average of 17 points per square meter return to us. On the empirical side, the data collected from the field. 2016, we're reflecting our stand metrics. They're looking at our trees, the basal area, the coarse woody debris, how many stems per hectare were there. In 2017, all looked at our understory plant communities. We start asking, how do the understory plant communities respond to the different forest structures that are above them? Summing up the ALS metrics, the vertical structure, stand height, canopy cover, density, and horizontal structure, looking at that coarse woody debris. I'll turn it back to Jay to give you our results.
Thanks very much, Colin. Yeah. And the way that we'll talk about our results is first focusing on what we got from the empirical data that collected. So this was what we were doing in the field, actually using some of the more common traditional ways of measuring forests and seeing whether or not we actually do get differences. Now, the first thing that we'll go through here is just looking at some of the individual stand structure metrics. And the one that I'm showing on this slide here, and one that I'm showing you here is basal area per hectare. And just using this as a representative stand structure metric, things like their deviator height, you see very similar responses. Now, within this figure, we're looking at the basal area per hectare. The two different land bases are knolls on the left-hand side, a really heterogeneous rolling type of landscape, versus the plateau, much more flat, kind of the low elevation sites or low elevation different sites that Colin was talking about. And we're looking at it across the three different height classes that Colin defined, trees that are around 10 meters, 20 meters, and trees that are 29 or stands that are 29 meters and above. And most importantly, it's separating out the management history. So this is really what I'd like you to focus on throughout the remainder of the results slide. The differences between our EG, or early growth sites that were harvested and then planted. Not surprisingly, they have a much smaller basal area here. And then really focusing on the difference between our harvest history sites and our old growth sites. As Colin mentioned, this is really the key thing that our work is focusing on. Looking at these harvest history sites, areas where there was diameter limit logging done about 30, 40, 50 years ago, it asks me the question of if these areas where there has previously been management, we see fundamentally different forest structures, either through the empirical data or by using these new ALS-based techniques. So just looking at the basal area here, the thing that I'd like you to take away from this is that, yeah, very easy to distinguish our early growth from our larger 20 to 29 meter stands. But not that much to distinguish the harvested from the old growth forests in the 20 and 29 meter classes. And particularly, if you look at the harvest history in the plateau, basal area in those stands is actually consistently higher than in our old growth sites. Now, that's just looking at individual stand structural metrics. The other way, in the same way that's a bit more informative, is actually use those individual metrics to develop stand diversity metrics. So here, this would be using techniques such as Shannon's diversity index to develop an aggregate measure of whether or not we have higher diversity, lower diversity in these different treatment units. Now, to look at this, the way that we'll just quickly go over this is looking at correlations between some of these individual metrics and some of the stem diversity metrics. They, in the top left, there is the basal area per hectare that we were just looking at. The row right below that, we're looking at the variation in DVH. And within each of these scatter plots, we've separated out the three main harvest or management histories for the sites. The early growth sites in blue, the old growth in black, and the harvest history in red. I think before I go on here, I'm actually going to switch over to a handset to try to improve some of the noise issues that we're getting. Can everyone still hear me with the handset here? I'm going to hope so. And to continue on, so looking at this, if we go into the bottom right of this figure, we have our species stem diversity index. So basically the Shannon's diversity index calculated using species and stem, and then our species diversity using species and BA. Now, don't worry about the details for this figure too much. The main thing that I'd like you to take away from it is that we do not get a very good separation between our old growth sites and our harvest history sites using these type of empirical metrics, either the individual structural metrics or the aggregate diversity metrics. So that suggests that there may actually be a problem in trying to identify these more biodiverse areas. Now, without going into a lot of detail, let's just run through some of the findings that came from this aspect of our work. And one of the big take-home messages is that, at least for this area that we're working in, there seems to be relatively small ecological legacy of some of those partial cuts or those diameter liminal cuts that were done about a half century ago. So we're not seeing big, really obvious differences in the stand structure. Now, that's in some ways nice, because we're saying that the forests seem to be recovering quite quickly from those previous management interventions. But it's also negative from the point of view that there's no really easy way of differentiating the partial cuts areas from our old forest areas on this land base. Now, what this also suggests is that in order to actually accurately pick up these management histories and these differences in presumed biodiversity value, we really need to develop a way of aggregating a range of different diversity metrics together in order to get a better idea of what the ecological integrity is. The last thing that I'll just point out about this aspect of our research is that one thing that really was noticeable is that there's no single variable that really defines old growth structure in this part of the world. There's lots of variation within our old growth sites with respect to all of the main metrics that we were looking at. Now, that's from the empirical side. Let's now move on to the kind of slightly more interesting aspect, which is looking at the ALS point cloud and seeing if we can actually differentiate our land base based on the points here. Now, the first thing that we can look at here is looking at, again, individual metrics that we can derive from that ALS point cloud. One of the biggest, or one of the most common ways of doing this is looking at where the various different percentiles are within our point cloud. So here we're looking at the height of the 90th percentile. And as we can see, not too surprisingly, with our KHH20 and PHH20, these are our earlier stands, so our smaller stands, and as you'd expect, they have a smaller 90th percentile.
If we then go and look at the 90th percentile for our harvest history and our old growth in both the knolls and the plateau, one thing that really jumps out at, that should jump out at you is there's not much of a difference whatsoever. So even though these areas were harvested, the height class that we're seeing there from the ALS is very similar. Now that's just an example of using vertical distribution to try to characterize these areas. The other thing that we can do is look at some metrics that are correlated with gap size and gap distribution within the landscape. So here we're looking at our canopy cover, and our canopy cover defined as the mass of points that are above 1.37 meters. And what you see there, particularly if you look at the knolls on the far left-hand side, is that we see the kind of expected transition of having more gaps within the forest as it ages or as it grows from a 20-meter height class into the 29-meter height class. That same type of transition isn't seen as well in the plateaus, and basically there's not much to differentiate these sites whatsoever in terms of canopy cover. So very similar to what we saw in the empirical results, not big differences that can easily be picked out between these forest types just using individual metrics. And the last thing that I'll show that again drives home that same point is looking at the density of points that occur in different height bins. So going from low height bins in the top left to high height bins, and really all I want you to take away from this is that there's a lot of variance across all of our forest types and we can't distinguish them. Now, the one thing that does give us really good ability to distinguish is forest coarse-wooded debris. And for this section, I'm actually going to pass back to Colin because this is one of his main interests and his main research focuses.
So one thing that was distinct from the rest of the research we've done so far, where we're not seeing a lot of differences, but here we see some significant difference in the coarse woody debris. So with the LiDAR point cloud, what we did in this case is we only looked at the points that were from 10 centimeters up to 1.2 meters in elevation, and and we did that simply because when we were doing our coarse woody debris surveys in the field, that's where the bulk of the coarse woody debris was. And we said, can we see the coarse woody debris in the LiDAR data set? And we have a really strong correlation here, or at least a very strong trend, looking from our harvest history sites, from a low or younger sites, the high class 20s, the KHH20, moving up KH29. So the stand's getting older and taller. We're starting to see more material fall out, so more coarse woody debris. More coarse woody debris, again, in the old growth sites with no harvest history in the OG29 sites. If you're looking at the images on the left-hand side, think of the green as the moss or the vegetation on the forest floor, and these the white and the brown as material that's above the forest floor. And these white linear features, I should mention that this is a 25 by 25 meter black box that you can see, and so it's actually a 25 centimeter raster. And these white lines that you can see in the image are in fact logs on the ground, which you can see distinct logs in the top image. This is an old forest site with a lot of coarse woody debris in it, versus an example of a harvest history site where you don't have a lot of linear features on that bottom image. Now there is some noise from saplings or advanced regen in the understories, the small trees growing in the understory, but you are missing those distinct logs on the ground. This also fits very well with some of the empirical data that we have collected, and this next slide here is looking at the coarse woody debris from the field sampling. So the one on the left is looking at number of pieces of coarse woody debris on the ground. We'll focus in on the ones that are highlighted with the orange boxes. So sites with harvest history in the large tree component having some coarse woody debris, but the old forest sites having distinctly more pieces of coarse woody debris. And we see that, not surprisingly, that there's a distinctly higher volume of coarse woody debris in our old forest site, our old growth site, on the image to the right.
Thanks, Colin. So just to summarize at this stage, basically looking at both the empirical data as well as the ALS data, we're not getting really good separation of our forest types apart from the coarse woody debris. Now that then leads into the question, can we actually separate out the biodiversity? Can we separate out the management history more appropriately if we use aggregate measures, trying to develop those algorithms that will allow us to say, yes, this is an area where there's higher biodiversity value or lower biodiversity value. And the way that we've approached that is using analysis that's functionally a linear discriminant function analysis to incorporate all these different predictor variables and see whether or not we can tease out these differences in our forest types. So the first slide that I'll show you here that we're looking at is looking at all of the ALS metrics that we collected and trying to tease out the different height classes that we're using in this multidimensional space that's represented by these two axes, or axes 1 and axes 2. Now, not too surprisingly, the different height classes separate really clearly, and the main predictor variables that we're using to separate them, not surprisingly, are the 50th and the 70th percentiles. So this doesn't really give us that much information, but it demonstrates that this technique is a valuable way for actually figuring out what's important for characterizing these forest types. We can then move on to the interesting question of what actually allows us to separate out the different management history sites that were part of our framework. So here we're looking at the same basically type of figure with an analysis where the predictor variables are only the percentile metrics that we calculated from the ALS data. And if we look along our first axis or x-axis, we see that the early growth sites really separate well from the old growth in the harvest history. And that's primarily just based on height metrics. Now if we look at the old growth in the harvest history, what we really want to try to tease apart, there's separation, but the separation's not that great. Now that again is only just using the percentile metrics. We then did that analysis, but used all of the available metrics that were available to us from the ALS. And basically we're looking at that analysis here, where the first axis still separates out the early growth from the other harvest history sites. And then if we look at the second axis, there, although it doesn't really look like it, we actually get much better separation from our old growth and our harvest history. And the predictor variables that were key loadings for this was the point density above the mean. So basically, where is the point mass within the ALS point cloud? The variation in return intensity that we had from ALS points. So not just where the height above ground for the points are, but the type of surface that they're reflecting off of. And then the 50th and the 90th percentiles, so information about how that canopy is actually distributed. And finally, the density of the canopy cover, which was our last metric. Now, this is actually really quite positive, and this kind of goes into some of the main findings that we've got at this stage. And that one of the main things that I'd like you to take away from that is that using our ALS-derived metrics actually provides much more power in order to distinguish the forest classes and get estimates of what the biodiversity value on our land base is, compared to some of those more common traditional metrics that we normally incorporate by going into the field and measuring empirically. Now, the second thing that I want to mention here is that we also did analysis where we used our ALS predictors and tried to determine which of those ALS predictors were best at giving us our overall aggregate empirical diversity metric. So this was using what is essentially a regression tree framework, and this allows us to identify what ALS predictors were most important. Now, the one that came out of that analysis as being best for separating out high diversity sites was the standard deviation in height. So not just the height of the stand, but actually the variation that you see within it. So something that we, again, goes back to kind of the theoretical premise of the work. We expect to see areas where there's more vertical structure to be higher in biodiversity, and that's played out in this analysis. The second feature that was important was gap size. So trying to figure out what type of gaps are in the forest. When you have forests with greater amount of gaps, greater variation gaps, that's again correlated with higher biodiversity. And finally, at the third level, we found that the number of returns above the plot mode and the 90th percentile were good predictors. So the take home from this is that we are demonstrating that we can separate out different biodiversity types using the ALS metrics, and it's proving to be actually much more effective than some of the historic methods that we've used. Now, going forward over the next couple of months here, where we're pushing this analysis is looking at scale and really trying to focus on what is the appropriate scale at which those different metrics should be evaluated, as well as incorporating some different type of biodiversity estimates in terms of shrub and herbaceous, biodiversity, and carbon inventory. Now, the last thing that I'll mention before we just pass over to the Nature Conservancy Canada is that this work with SFI and the Conservation Grants Program has also allowed us to move into doing predictive ecosystem mapping, which is moving beyond just the forest state, but also to those other attributes that are going to be really important for diversity, such as the water, which we'll be hearing about from the Nature Conservancy Canada in a second here. So I'll just finish up here by saying that if you have any questions, please forward them on to either Colin or myself. We'd be more than happy to talk to you. And I'm not sure if you want to have questions now or save it till the end. And with that, I'll pass it back to Paul, Rocco, and the Nature Conservancy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jay. We appreciate the presentation. And let me just offer a reminder to everyone to please mute unless you're actually actively speaking. There's a lot of noise on this line, and we find it difficult to control from where we are. So please do mute if you can. Does anyone have a question right now? If so, you can unmute yourself or you can type it into the chat box. Any questions? Okay, we see a hand raised. David Young.
Sorry, I meant to leave a comment instead of hit the hand, but I'll say it anyways. Just want to thank the presenters for a nice logical storyboard that was easy to understand and puts a little light on the LiDAR metrics that we don't normally tease out. But no, it's just a thank you.
We appreciate that. Thank you very much. So there was a text question from Justin Schlawin. How do you differentiate between seedlings and coarse-wooded debris? And that's a great question because the way that we're actually separating out the coarse-wooded debris is basically putting a height cap on the ALS data and looking at what's occurring below that. Now when you do that, you're obviously going to capture everything that's on the ground, the seedlings, the coarse-wooded debris. What we're looking at is trying to use the linear nature of the coarse-wooded debris to really be the key thing for separating out large coarse-wooded debris inputs from some of the other things that will be occurring on the ground, be it the seedlings, be it rocks, be it stumps. But that is a challenge when we're doing this. Right now we're seeing that we do have good correlations between just the massive points that are below a 5 meter or a 1 meter level and correlating that with our empirical measures of coarse-wooded debris.
Thank you. Any other questions for our presenters at this time? We have a question from Sarah Lewis.
That's a great question, and it's something that we haven't frankly focused on yet. So the question is, are you able to identify areas of invasive pest infestation using this approach? Now, I say it's a very good question because right now in the central interior BC, we're experiencing a little bit of a spruce beetle outbreak, and we definitely have spruce beetle occurring in some of our sites. So what we want to be doing is going forward, looking to see if we actually do see differences in forest structure in those areas where the beetles have got into. But as of yet, no, that really hasn't been something that we've been able to look at. And just while I'm answering Sarah's question, James Churchill asked, have you looked into whether these findings hold for varying laser point densities? And no, that's a great question, and a question I think we really need to address when we're thinking about the validity of LiDAR. As Colin mentioned, the data set that we were able to work with was around 15 to 17 points per square meter, which in these days is about an intermediate density of points, or we're finding that as an intermediate density point. And we're finding that that level of points, or that density, is sufficient to allow us to get good estimates of what the forest structure is. If you drop down to 4 or 5 points per square meter, you're likely going to lose a lot of that resolution that's necessary for really capturing the data appropriately. And Colin just mentioned the other thing that we should say there is the timing of acquisition for biodiversity estimation is going to be very important. We had leaf-off flight conditions, which allowed us to really get a better idea about what that understory coarse-wooded debris structure is. So with that, I'll say thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you both. With that, I think that we should close the questions for now and move on to our next presenter. Marie-Andre, we'll turn it over to you. And just a reminder once again to everyone who is not presenting, please mute your phone so we can keep the noise to a minimum. Thank you very much. Marie?
Yes, hi. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Jay and Colin, for your presentation. It was very interesting. Hi, everyone. As Paul said at the beginning, I'm a project manager at the Nature Conservancy of Canada. I will also be sharing this presentation with Philippe Bournival and Jean Fink from CERFO. Just in case some of you never heard of the Nature Conservancy of Canada, or NCC, before, we are a Canadian national land conservation organization. We secure properties either by donation, land purchase, or conservation agreement, and then manage them for the long term. Scientific research is very important for NCC's work. All our decisions, from conservation priorities identification to the assessment of strategies' effectiveness, are based on science. Thanks to SFI and its conservation grant program, for the last 2 years, NCC has been involved in a project to investigate biodiversity impacts of forest management on vernal pools. To do so, we partner with Canuck Canada ULC, an SFI certified forest company. Also the Canuck Institute, as I said, Philippe Bournival and Jean Fink from CERFO, as well as other researchers from the Géotop Lab from Université du Québec à Montréal, also researchers from l'Institut des sciences de la forêt tempérée from Université du Québec en Outaouais, as well as the Quebec government and Duck Limited. So there's many people that took part in this project. So let me bring you a little more east. The project took place in Quebec, close to Montebello, where the red dot is on the map, on the Canuck property. This is about halfway between Montreal and Ottawa. I don't know if some of you heard of the Canuck property before. This is a unique, gorgeous place, or maybe some of you even were enough lucky to visit it for hiking or fishing. Amongst others, the Canuck property offers a unique site for scientific research. The ownership of this 65,000 acres, or 260 square kilometers of wilderness, is divided between NCC, an outfitting business called Canuck Nature, and the SFI certified forestry company Canuck Canada ULC. The property is divided into several zones where the land uses vary according to each owner's missions. Hence, this natural lab offers a variety of contexts for researchers and makes it a unique place to study ecosystems and the relation between nature and land uses. The objective of this specific research project was to investigate the biodiversity impact of forest management on vernal pools. More specifically, researchers looked at the impact of even age and uneven age management on hydrology, fauna, and flora in and around vernal pools. Philippe Bournival and Jean Fink will go into the details regarding what are vernal pools and how they can be identified and mapped in a few minutes. But just for now, let's say that vernal pools are small wetlands. Even though they are temporary wetlands, sometimes wet, sometimes dry, they are an essential habitat for, amongst other, various amphibians, using them for many reasons, many things, but reproduction is one of the important uses. We can say that to date, knowledge on vernal pool is rather limited. According to Dr. Larocque, one of the project researcher, it is the first time that hydrodynamic of vernal pool was studied. Within this project, we discovered that both surface water and groundwater influence the water level of the pools. Also, within this project, DNA analyses were made on water samples to identify vernal pools fauna. Surveys of flora were also done around the pools. There's a lot that could be said about this project, but I won't go into all the details to let Philippe and Jean discuss the main topic of this webinar, which is the LiDAR.
So thank you, Marie-André, for your quick presentation of the Canuck properties. So I'm Philippe Bournival from CERFO. As you quickly notice, I used to speak French, and I want to give you my apologies for the rest of my presentation will be in French. No, I'm kidding. I will do my best to give you good English. So thanks, Che and Colin, for your presentation and for introducing us how aerial LiDAR works. The project that I want to talk to you started 2 years ago with NCC and SFI grant program on the Canucks property. Like Marie-André said, this is a 3-part project. So Marie Larocque at UQAM are studying hydrodynamics of vernal pool. Yann Surget-Grosbas at Université du Québec en Outaouais are studying environmental DNA on the vernal pools. And for us, CERFO, we're working on the first part of the project is to map vernal pool on the landscape scale. So how do we do this? So who we are Centre d'enseignement et de recherche en foresterie. We are a collegial research center supported by Quebec Ministry for Higher Education. We used to work remote sensing applied to hydrography since 2014. We start with a small territory, 1 square kilometer. We did another project in 2015 with 255 square kilometers. And we're repeating this work on a larger on landscape. We have two projects in progress that John will talk to you a little bit later in our presentation. So this slide shows the difference between LiDAR, before LiDAR and after LiDAR. So I want to show you the difference between DAM, what we had before LiDAR with 10-meter resolution and what we have after LiDAR with 1-meter resolution. So it's only to show you that it's very difficult or impossible to map vernal pools before LiDAR. The difficulty is how do we do this with all of this information. So the study area, Miranda showed you before, we're working for vernal pool on the red part of the Outaouais. It's in deciduous forest in Quebec land. So the method, so what we use, we used a LiDAR 10 points per square meter to make dam depression, acquired in June 2015. This is a Regal 480. We used high-resolution satellite spring imagery to map spring water. The image was acquired in May 2015. This is the Pleiad sensor with 50 centimeters resolution. We use satellite summer imagery, so to map summer water, acquired in mid-September 2015 with the Pleiad sensor. So what we did, we combining technology to map vernal pools and wetland on Canuck territory. Here is a slide to show you an example of how we use a LiDAR intensity image to map water. By using threshold on the intensity, we can find water on the land. So the left image show you shallow water with the blue contour. And on the right image, I show you the blue is the automated water and identification. After doing that with LiDAR, we'll do this with satellite imagery. So here is an example of map wetland with summer 2015 satellite imagery. So as you see in the black, you see all the water. And next slide, in the yellow, you have what is mapped before combining technology, and in blue, what we had after combining technology. So there's a lot of misinformation with the government-based map, and we just put more information on the map at the Canuck properties. So one of the project spin-offs is we update water mapping with this project, and the principal impact was on the area of 3,000 and less square meters. So as you see, the before combining technology, the map water have 57 hectares, and after 139 hectares. So the total is quite the same, and the principal difference is with the smaller area. So I will pass the next to Jean. Will explain to you, it's our biologist, will explain to you what is vernal pool and how do we map Canuck properties vernal pools. So Jean?
Thank you, Philippe. As you all know, or probably know, vernal pools are ephemeral pools or temporary pools. The far-fetched object of this project was to try to find a method to identify vernal pools on the ground. As Philip stated earlier, the usual maps that are used for forestry planning or topographical maps that are made by the federal government lack a lot of information on the water distribution on the surface of the land, and this brings us a difficulty to identify temporary pools, and these are very important for reproduction of some species, mostly salamanders and frogs. They're also used by other wildlife species, but indicative species of vernal pools are mostly salamanders and the wood frog. So a vernal pool is isolated from the permanent hydrographic network, and it's isolated from more than 10 meters of permanent wetland. It's a wetland that is in a forested environment that is inundated mainly in spring with the snow melt, and it dries up in the summertime. It generally has an area of less than 0.1 hectare, and so 100 square meters, and the water depth is generally less than 1 meter. And one very important characteristic of a vernal pool is the absence of fish, but it's inhabited by amphibians and reptile species. To differentiate the important vernal pool, it's in the literature. It's the threshold has the hydro period should be of at least 2 months to sustain a full reproduction cycle of salamanders or wood frogs also. So using the LiDAR, which identifies the depressions in the surface of the soil, when we look at the depressions of 50 to 1,000 square meters, we found out that the LiDAR data gave us 18,049 depressions with an area of 417 hectares. Now, when we take these 18,000 depressions and we look at those that are isolated more than 10 meters of the hydrographic system, it brings that down to about half, to 9,600 depressions, with half of the area also. And if we apply the third criteria, less than 1 meter in depth, that brings us down to 9,200 depressions. And if we look at the drainage area between 50 and 5,000 square meters, it brings us down to about 6,500 depressions. When we look at the spring, the presence of water in the spring, well, it brings us down to 957 depressions that are potential vernal pools. And now, like I said, they're temporary pools, so they have to dry up in the summer. When we look at the summer image, it brings us down to 765 potential vernal pools. Now, we added two more criteria: the difference of the mean normalized difference vegetation index and the difference of maximum normalized difference of wetness index. We're able to bring that down from 18,000 potential vernal pools to 362 potential vernal pools, with a total combining a total area of 10 hectares on the territory. The difference of the mean normalized difference vegetation index is the difference between the two images in the spring and the summer in the means of pixels present in the depressions, in the 18,000 depressions that I mentioned earlier. It characterizes the photosynthetic activity of the vegetation within the depression. And when we did the statistics, the ANOVA, excuse me here, showed that the vernal pools are statistically different than the other types of wetlands on the territory. Now, if we look at the normalized, normalized difference of water index, same thing here is the difference between the two images, spring and summer. For the pixel showing the highest value of humidity, it characterizes the presence of water in the vegetation and the free water on the surface. Again, the statistics on this shows that the vernal pools are statistically different than the other type of wetlands on the territory. We did a field campaign to validate if those 362 potential vernal pools were actually vernal pools. We randomly visited 99 vernal pools to validate our technique. And the performance of the remote sensing method showed us that 93% of our potential depressions are actually wetlands, and 73% of those depressions are actually vernal pools. All of them were absent from the previous mapping that we used to start the project. So these vernal pools were not mapped before. That's good, interesting information, so that our technique is quite accurate to identify the vernal pool, potential vernal pools. As Marie-André said, the University of Quebec in the Outaouais is responsible for environmental DNA sampling in the pools to check out if those pools are actually used by amphibians or reptiles. So we stratified the sampling in 5 different forest types. Unharvested, which is actually for us that has not been harvested for at least 40 years. The second type was uneven age 15 years, and then 30 years, 15 years, and 30 years. Our goal was to sample at least 10 vernal pools in each of the different strata, and we managed to get more than 10 samples, as you can see in the table here. The analysis of the DNA is being done by University of Quebec in Outaouais and also University of McGill. We visited the samples and collected water with a syringe and conserved it and filtered it in the same day. This is an ongoing project. It will be repeated next year. So the data that comes out of that part of the project is still only partial. The partial results right now seems to show that there's no significant difference between even age and uneven age management practices. The community structures shows that the older the cut, more than 30 years, the more similarity of the biological structure with the control sites, which are the unharvested plots. So it means that after 30 years of the date of harvest, it seems that the biological structure, the number of species within the vernal pool seem to reach the same thing as unharvested forest types. Also, one of the findings that the sampling period and the quantity of water in each sample seem to have an important impact on the results. We found out that when we're going to repeat this project next summer, each vernal pool will have to be sampled more than once because of the period when the different species go in the vernal pools has influenced the results of the quality of the markers that we can spot in the water, and also that it seems that the more water you sample for environmental DNA with the method that the university is using, you need to sample a larger volume of water to get more definite results. This is to show the typical vernal pool in the unharvested forest type. And when we visited that pool last spring, took a photo of egg masses that is actually egg masses of spotted salamanders. I'd like to point out the importance of time-precise imagery. The previous presenters stated out that you need a leafless period for laser and LiDAR, aerial LiDAR, and also satellite imagery. You need to compare the spring and the summer imagery to bring out some conclusions. On the top left, the red circle around this potential vernal pool shows the depression, and on the right side, top right side, you see that the presence of water that was shown with the automated method that Philip explained. And if you look at the bottom left, this is the summer image where you cannot see any water on the imagery, but the topographic wetness index using the LiDAR technology shows the actual distribution of the water underneath the canopy. Again, the importance of time-precise imagery. The top photo is a spring photograph that was taken of a vernal pool, and the same vernal pool visited in the month of August showed it was dried up, and the vegetation that grew on the bottom of the vernal pool. The physical attributes of vernal pools, like I said, we evaluated that there were 362 vernal pools within the Canuck territory. 272 of them were isolated, and 90 of them were complex, that be 2 or more vernal pools that are less than 30 meters apart. The average depth of the isolated vernal pools was 1.19 meters with a confidence interval of 0.07. The drainage area of isolated vernal pools is 1,975 square meters with a confidence intervals of 170 square meters, and the mean area is 293 square meters. The complex of vernal pools, like I said, 2 or more vernal pools less than 30 meters apart, well, the depth is a little bit shallower, and the drainage area is about 3,843 square meters, and the mean area is 520 square meters. All of the vernal pools were located in poor drainage area, and the thickness of organic matter is varies between 20 and 40 centimeters. The strength of this methodology is that you can treat large areas in a very short time. It enables you to acquire quickly knowledge on the number, distribution, and size of the vernal pools. It has a vast potential for updating surface hydrography data on watersheds, and the development of statistical data on water coverage, drainage area, depths, spectral indexes, like I said, the normalized differential vegetation index and wetness index. The limits of this technology is that it does not identify vernal pools located outside of aerial LiDAR ground depressions. Of course, we visited the vernal pools that we had identified using the combined aerial LiDAR and satellite imagery, but walking on the field, we found some vernal pools that had not been identified. So the precision of this technology is yet to be defined. Some difficulties to segregate them from the field, from other type of wetlands. Of course, when we validate the potential vernal pools found by combining the two technologies, we go out at a certain period of time. If there's water in there or not water, we have a snapshot of what it is as a validation, but has to be should be visited more than once to validate thoroughly the method. Of course, to start a project like that, you have to start with good mapping of linear and surface waterways. Government database or forestry mapping area are a good start, but as Philip pointed out, a lot of missing information there. Also, we need to obtain time-precise, high-resolution images to confirm the presence of vernal pools. It's impossible to confirm the location of vernal pools with only one image. You have to go with a spring and a summer image to compare the presence of water or the absence of water. The spin-off of this project for Canuck was we updated the hydrography mapping of the Canuck territory. We integrated a database in the forestry activity planning, and it enabled to start a project for conservation of vernal pools. As an example, these are strip cuts within the Canuck territory, and the red dots are the actual potential vernal pools. So we derived conservation measures for vernal pools inspired from SFI criteria. We put a 10-meter buffer with no circulation of machinery. It's a flag buffer buffer zone, and within this buffer zone, a 50% harvest is allowed in a 10-meter buffer zone without the circulation of machinery. The other spin-off of this project, we're actually using this technique to map at a fine scale the habitats of the western chorus frog, which is a threatened species in this part of the country. And we've also used this method. We're doing a project right now to develop automated tools for mapping linear hydrography and sites and with drainage constraints for forestry operations. Intermittent or temporary creeks are not mapped, and the forest regulations have some constraints on those type of hydrography, but they are not mapped. So with this new technology, I think combining the LiDAR and the satellite, we're able to map the intermittent creeks and waterways. Also, another spin-off is that we increased the quality of Ducks Unlimited's wetland mapping by the addition of an eighth class of their classification for wetland mapping. They added the vernal pools as an eighth class of their different wetland classes. What I want to point out with this table here is that this is the classification used by Ducks Unlimited for wetlands. Overall, on the Canucks mapping of wetlands, we found out 3,557 depressions with water. Out of that, 362 vernal pools, which comprise an area of 10 hectares on a total of close to 4,000 hectares of wetlands. These vernal pools compose 0.03% of the total wetlands on the Canuck territory, and they comprise also, although 10% of the numbers of wetlands on the territory, and they comprise 0.3% of the area of the wetland. As a conclusion, temporal analysis with the spring and summer imagery of water bodies is essential for the identification of vernal pools. The addition of the values of differential means of the NDVI and the maximum NDWI enable to refine the criteria for the identification of vernal pools. and it reduces the confusion with other types of wetlands. Vernal pools are close parents with wooded swamp, but smaller in size. Also, this project enabled the development of skills for participating students as trainees in a research-related work environment. And since we do transfer of technology with our partners, it enables also development of high-skilled workforce. Just to conclude, I'd like to thank all the partners that enable us to work on Canuck territory, and that's it for me.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We do have a few minutes left for questions. We will make sure we don't run over time, but we would entertain any questions now, either by typing into the Q&A box, or if you'd like to raise your hand and we can hear from you that way. Any questions for either of our presenters? Okay, we have a question from Chris Smith, or maybe just a comment. Chris, would you like to offer a comment as well? Okay, no, just written in the box. Justin Schwartz asked, did you have an estimate of error of omission using your PVP analysis?
I would let Phil answer this.
Okay, just like Jean said before, we just validate if our the combining technology works well. So we just visited the 99 sites, 99 vernal pools, and 73% of them was vernal pool, and 93% of them was wetlands. The balance was rock shallow. Ombre, Jean, on a dit c'est quoi?
Shadow.
Shadow, rock shallow or shadow or so the missing 7% is from the shadow. So this is where we are with this estimate of error.
All right, thank you for that. We also have a question from Sarah Lewis asking if we can envision companies being able to assess biodiversity impacts using vernal pools as indicators. And I can tell you from SFI's perspective, we hope that this information, this kind of new application of this methodology could be valuable to helping our program participants understand biodiversity-related impacts and utilization of LiDAR. But I would turn this question back to our researchers and ask if you've thought about this.
Well, we did quite an intensive literature research on what is being done in the northeastern states to protect vernal pools. They have an approach that before protecting a vernal pool or the species that use it, it has to be a certified vernal pool. By being certified, it has to be acknowledged by a certified biologist in wetland science, and it has to have at least 10 masses of egg masses in the spring to certify a vernal pool, so in order to have a certain protection. There are a lot of guidelines for best practices that are out there in the literature, but here in Quebec we have an approach that, since there are many vernal pools but so small importance as far as the relative importance of the area that they occupy on the ground, the Quebec government is actually looking into putting buffer zones around the identified vernal pools with this methodology, so that there are different best practices call for maintaining 50 to a 75% canopy cover on a buffer zone varying from 50 to 125 meters from the center of the vernal pool. We're not there yet, but that seems to be the way the government wants to go in the future. So I think that protecting all identified vernal pools with this methodology will probably be the way that the Quebec government will go in the future.
All right, thank you very much. That brings our period of discussion to a close. I want to thank our researchers in particular at both UNBC and NCC for your participation both in the projects themselves and this webinar today. We know everyone is very busy, and we appreciate everyone that participated. I do want to remind everyone that we do have a meeting of our sounding board coming up in Washington, D.C. in March of 2018. And if you would like more information about that, I suggest that you can respond directly to Rocco Saracena, who was the person who sent out the announcement regarding this webinar, or reach out to us in any other way. You're certainly welcome to contact me as well, and we're happy to fill you in on that. Once again, thanks to everyone for participating. If you have any more questions, you can forward those to us or directly to the researchers involved, and we're happy to try to get those questions answered for you. So thank you again, and be on the lookout for future webinars in this series. We hope to do this again. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.